Lane Kiffin wanted the Alabama job when Nick Saban retired, and he tried to get into the mix and could not get into the mix. You could argue partly why he couldn't get the job is all the things that we're talking about here today.
Because, I mean, what's the biggest game he's ever won? Let's be honest. You know, he's known for playing in big games and not winning them.
This episode of Beat Everyone is brought to you by Broadway Joe's Fantasy Sports. Inspired by football legend Joe Namath, embrace the thrill of daily fantasy sports like never before in an app coming this fall.
Welcome to Beat Everyone. I'm Ben Flanagan. I'm joined by AL.com's Michael Casagrande for a very special episode today. We are now joined by a former colleague of ours, but who is now a national college football writer for 24/7 Sports. He's the author of The Leadership Secrets of Nick Saban, How Alabama's Coach Became the Greatest Ever. And his new book, co-written with Armen Keteyian, is called The Price, What It Takes to Win in College Football's Era of Chaos, which is out today. So go grab it. John Talty, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. It's like we're getting the band back together. This is fun.
John, you made headlines this week with some passages from the book. Michael wrote about it regarding Nick Saban's volatile relationship with Lane Kiffin, if people can believe it. And at the time, you know, I think both men played it off as though it was sort of a laughable thing than kind of the situation that you describe. Do you think that they had any genuine affection for each other in the midst of all that tension?
Yeah, I think that they do. And I think that some of what we've seen after the fact, I think it's like looking back with hindsight, and I think you can appreciate the moments even more. I think that looking back at it, I think Nick Saban, I don't want to say amused, but I think he can see some of that Lane is a unique character and that there are parts of him that I think can be, you know, funny. And I think Lane has talked a lot about how, you know, since leaving Alabama and being a head coach again, that he better understands, you know, why Nick did what he did and kind of sees in himself now, you know, how he probably was annoying at times with Nick and just kind of always wanting to do things his way. And in some ways how he wouldn't tolerate that himself now as the head coach at Ole Miss. So, you know, I don't think it was constant stress, but you are taking two people that are about as polar opposite, odd couple as possible. And I think that was both the magic of it and also why it was never destined to last very long. I think that they both needed each other in that moment. I think they both brought something to the other that complemented them in a great way. But you know, those guys were always going to be seeing the world very differently. And, you know, since they've gone on to do other things, we've seen that play out in plenty of ways too.
But still, it lasted 3 years. I mean, I still can't get over that they were together for 3 years. When he first got hired, it's like, this is going to be a 1 year and done. I can't see them surviving. I say 3 years. There's 2 years and almost 95% of the next year clearly ending poorly. It still blows my mind that they were able to coexist for as long as they did. And I'm sure it wasn't because they just couldn't get rid of each other. I think Lane was definitely looking for jobs in that process. I'm sure it's covered in the book, but 3 years is insane when I think about it.
Yeah, and you know what Brent mentioned in the beginning, that, you know, the AL.com story that you did, Michael, about it. There's this one scene in which Lane is calling Jimmy Sexton about trying to get him in the mix for different jobs. And Jimmy gets pretty upset with him and starts screaming at him, like, just win games. Like, if you win games, you'll get jobs. And I remember at the time, as we were all colleagues at AL.com, writing about, you know, Lane Kiffin's career rehabilitation after that 2015 season just wasn't quite there yet. I think he was trying to get in the mix. I think it was 2015, I can't remember if it was 2015 or 2016 when he had a shot at the Houston job. But he was trying to start to get in the mix for different jobs. And I remember talking to different search firm type people who were involved in those searches. And at that time, he was still a little too toxic. So I think if it was up to Lane, he might have tried to leave after 2, but he wasn't quite there. He hadn't fully kind of done everything he needed to do. And then, as you mentioned, didn't quite get to a full 3. And that's, you know, I wrote about it in my first book, and we mentioned it again in this book. But like, I sometimes have to stop and remind myself how insane it is that Lane Kiffin got fired in between a semifinal game and a national championship game. Like, I think he is probably one of one. I don't know if that'll ever happen ever again. And it just, we kind of forget about it because there's so many Lane antics and there's so many funny stories. But like, that's crazy to me. And that speaks to also how fed up I think Nick Saban was at that point with Lane, and just like, this might even take us back a step, but I can't deal with this guy another week because he's just not locked in the way that I need him to be ahead of a championship game.
And I remember them trying to sell it as a mutual parting of ways. And I just remember sitting in that news conference that day, looking at Saban and being like, you're going to tell me you guys mutually just came to this decision in between a semifinal and a championship, and you're going to tell me that this was like, it was insane. But also, I mean, you had a pretty decent stand-in, fill-in coming in. Granted, he wasn't the offensive coordinator the whole season, but you had Steve Sarkisian, now coach of Texas, as that one game replacement, and was set to be the replacement for the following season before he went to the Falcons. But just that whole sequence, that whole week, from the time he got hired at FAU to the time he left was really fascinating.
Yeah, no, and I can remember. I think I was flying to New Orleans for the Sugar Bowl because Auburn was playing in the Sugar Bowl, and I think it was around when I landed in New Orleans where that news broke. So it was not long after the game, and again, as time has passed, we've learned that it was building for a while, and I think how he handled himself that week, I think, didn't help his cause. There were a lot of issues where he was doing interviews, he was taking phone calls during practice. He ended up calling plays in the game that had not been practiced, which obviously upset Nick Saban. And, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on here, but he had that line talking about, said in jest, but like, I don't remember any happy moments. I just remember the blank chewings. And, I don't think that played super well within the building as well.
I think it was ass chewings.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that.
We did it.
Well, there's some, just so people know, there are some bad words used in the book, just so, PG-13 warning.
John, tell me if I'm wrong here. Their relationship is just obviously so fascinating, just like an unbelievable dynamic. I think it's probably genuine, but Kiffin almost overdoes it when he discusses Saban publicly. Like, he lavishes him with praise. He calls him the GOAT. He's obviously made some cracks here and there, but he's articulated what Saban has meant to him professionally since he left Alabama. But like, how tongue-in-cheek do you think it is? Like, I mean, how genuine do you think it is? Do you think that there is like something else there, like we need to read between the lines whenever Kiffin talks about Saban publicly?
I think it's both. I mean, I think there's always an angle with Lane. And so I think, especially during the Jimbo Fisher and Nick Saban feud, which, we write about pretty heavily in the book, Lane just really does not like Jimbo Fisher. And so I think he started leaning even heavier into Saban's the GOAT. I think he would refer to, when he would tweet from like Juice Kiffin, the dog account, referring to Saban as like grandfather or whatever. I mean, he was getting a little weird with it, but I think a lot of that is a show. I do think there's a lot of respect, again, for I think what Saban did for his career and how he helped him get back on track. I mean, it's again, another thing that I think is kind of amazing to think about is just how many good jobs he burned through by like 35, between USC, Tennessee, the Raiders. He was pretty radioactive when he got to Alabama. And so I think Kiffin appreciates, what Nick did for him in that regard and, the things that he learned from him. But it's definitely over the top. I think there's a mutual respect there between the two of those guys. But, I think the tweets are more tongue-in-cheek than anything.
I'm sorry. Are you telling me that Lane Kiffin controls the Juice Kiffin Twitter account? Like, did everybody know
I don't know
that?
if he's tweeting it. He's pretty involved. He's involved in everything.
Dogs don't have thumbs.
But I mean,
Juice. Yeah, I don't think Juice can tweet. Unfortunately, I don't know if I'm breaking news there, but
I would have assumed like an Ole Miss, media relations. But no, it's probably Lane Kiffin. That's incredible. Do you have any sense of what the other coaches on Saban's staff, like how they felt about the situation that you write about in the book? Like, was it awkward for them? Like, did they think it was funny? Like, what did that do, I guess, for the culture behind the scenes?
I think people were amused by it. Yeah. I mean, I think, working for Nick Saban is challenging. Everybody knows that. I think everybody has been on the receiving end of some ass chewings. And so I think when one guy is getting a lot of them, and that means you're not getting them, that's good for you. And so I think Lane was kind of like a magnet for Nick Saban's ire, and that means you aren't getting it. And, the thing with Saban is, you guys know this, like, not only do I think, they've made a big play over the last probably 5-6 years. Like, Nick Saban's actually pretty funny. And, I think he absolutely can be, but he's also, I think, very unintentionally funny. And so I think, like, when Nick Saban just let him loose on Lane and some of the things he would say to Lane, I think a lot of guys had to kind of like stifle laughter because it was, I think, pretty amusing for people to witness that.
Yeah, and one thing that we've heard many times from former Saban assistants is that there's obviously a lot of camaraderie among guys who have worked for Saban, and obviously there's nobody quite like Kiffin, but there were other assistants who maybe had a tougher time, or excuse me, were there other assistants who maybe had a tougher time seeing eye to eye with Saban other than Kiffin?
I mean, I think everybody has their moments, and I think sometimes you've seen guys cycle out of there pretty fast, and I think that can be an indication that one way or another, it wasn't the perfect fit. I wouldn't say it's not seeing eye to eye, but I would say, Kirby Smart probably had the hardest job in that building for a long time, from LSU to NFL to then Alabama, dealing with not only DBs, and eventually he moved off of them, I think, because people knew Saban was just going to live in that room. But when you're coaching DBs, you're dealing with Nick Saban all day, basically, because you're getting him in staff meetings, defensive staff, position coach, and he's going to be in all of those. And so that's a lot of time with Nick Saban, and that gives you more opportunity to get yelled at. So that's always challenging, I think, for DB coaches and especially guys who are DCs. But, there are certain guys that just were not fits at all. I mean, Michael definitely knows of some of them. I won't say a specific name, but, there was a defensive line coach a few years back that was just not a fit from, realized almost from day one it was not going to work out, and he was gone after a year.
Well, I mean, my last thing on Kiffin here is he really seems to play fast and loose as a public figure, like a high-profile person in college football in its biggest conference. I mean, he has this reputation as a troll, and he really seems to enjoy that. And while he appears to be trying to climb the mountaintop of college football again, like, what do you think Kiffin gets out of the comments that he makes, the tweets, the general trolling? Is it just his personality, and is it... and it's never going to change, or do you think that it sort of gives him some sort of weird advantage of sorts over other coaches who might play it more by the book?
I think it's both. And so I write in the book that Lane Kiffin's mom's nickname for him as a kid was Helicopter, because he's always just trying to stir things up. So from a young age, I think this is who Lane is. He's always kind of been this guy. I think he likes stirring the pot. I think what's interesting, I don't want to go too far on a tangent here, but Lane Kiffin in person is like quiet, kind of introverted. I would say even awkward at times. Like, I think sometimes people see the social media stuff and think he's just this huge personality because he's so out there on Twitter. He's really not like that in person. He's got kind of a dry sense of humor. He's kind of quiet, says it's under his breath. It's very different, I think, than the perception he has. But I do think he realizes he's got to find an edge. He's got to find a way to do things a little bit differently. His way is kind of leaning into using social media to get Ole Miss talked about, and it's worked. And I think one of the things that we talk about in this book is just some of the big names that have obviously left the sport in the last year, and two of our main characters are Nick Saban and Jim Harbaugh. I was thinking after that happened, like, who's the biggest name in college football at this point? And I think you could argue it's Lane Kiffin. I mean, Kirby Smart's up there, but in terms of who really moves the needle, who, when there's an AL.com headline, is going to provoke the most amount of people to click on it within college football, I would guess it's Lane Kiffin right now. And that's a credit to him keeping himself in the news through social media, when Ole Miss has not traditionally been the school that gets the most national attention.
And it's very interesting because, like, when you look at the actual success and what he's done on the field and the games, for him to be the most recognizable name is a credit to his ability to make himself put himself in the news. Because, I mean, what's the biggest game he's ever won? Let's be honest. He's known for playing in big games and not winning them. So that maybe this is his year where he can shed that label. But, he's a lot of shiny objects and a lot of misdirection. But he when it comes down to winning the game that pushes him over the top to be, in an SEC championship into a playoff game, they just haven't been there. So,
I mean, this is clearly the year that they're all in. And, I think that's what we've seen. And it's a theme that we hit on in the book is, with the advent of NIL, there's an ability to say, all right, let's make a run this year. Let's spend more money than we traditionally would have been able to. And I think Ole Miss is a great example. They've been very aggressive in the transfer portal. It's a lot of, 1-year rentals, basically. And we've seen this play out professionally. And I think to me, Ole Miss might be the most interesting team in the country this year for this exact reason, where it feels just very boom or bust. Like, I can remember, this is an NFL example, but I remember years ago, the Eagles loaded up on all these guys and they called themselves the dream team, and it didn't work out. Like, sometimes adding all of these new faces into your program can create challenges, especially if you have some bumps along the way. So this is kind of a playoff or bust year for Lane Kiffin, and we'll see if he can kind of elevate that program up. But yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you, Michael. But I mean, I'll ask you this: like, who's more recognizable and moves the needle more than Lane Kiffin?
Yeah, no, and I don't disagree with
Yeah.
you. I'm just saying that is such a credit to his ability to do that and create his own publicity, because it's not because they're carrying him off the field in Atlanta in championship games.
Yeah, the only other person I guess that you could put up there is Deion Sanders at this point, as somebody who is obviously a huge personality, which people like us obviously thrive on and from a content standpoint. But Lane Kiffin he's just the gift that keeps on giving in that regard. But, you know, John, I mean, you have a tough job. Like, I wonder how eager are people to talk about these topics, like whether it's coaches, NIL, recruiting, any hot button issue in college football where you have to choose your words carefully, publicly and behind the scenes. But everyone seems very opinionated, even if they have to walk on eggshells while they do it. But once you really get them talking, what are the revelations like for you as somebody who works so hard to get it out of them?
It's extremely challenging to start. And, you know, one of the things that I ran into numerous times, especially in the beginning, we're still trying to figure out some of the ways we were going to want to go with this book was, you know, I'd see someone say something, you know, in a radio interview or some sort of interview, like, you know, yeah, this school is trying to tamper with my player, or, you know, this unnamed school was offering X amount of money to try to steal my player away. And then I would follow up either with that coach directly or their SID. Hey, this is fascinating. Like, I'd love to know more. Like, can we talk about the specific school, the specific situation? And every single time, be like, no, he decided he doesn't want to go further. So guys love to talk a big game, but they don't really want to spill a lot of the secrets. And some of it's just these kind of unwritten rules, and you keep it in the family and you don't talk about it. And you don't, every coach, if you talk to a college coach right now, complains about tampering, but they never want to say who's actually tampering. They just want to complain about general tampering. So it makes it tricky to actually pinpoint stuff down. But I think when you're able to find some coaches who are willing to talk, and, you know, one of the coaches who's familiar to Alabama fans, Mike Loxley, who's now the Maryland head coach, you know, I spent a lot of time with him, and he was very candid. Like, it took some time to build the relationship and get him going, but once he kind of started going, he was willing to be open with me about what it's really like. And we talked a lot about, you know, what Maryland went through with Talia Tagovailoa and different programs trying to poach him and tamper it with him, and just the challenges at kind of that middle of the pack school where, the way Loxley put it, like, you're kind of getting eaten from both sides. You've got the big boys coming down to poach your guys who they could play at another level. And then on the flip side, you've got the smaller schools that are stealing all your depth players that, hey, come to Charlotte, you can start here where you're going to be the number 2 at Maryland. And, you know, it's a very real challenge. And I thought he spoke very, very eloquently and candid about what that was, you know, all on the record, none of it on background or off the record, and that kind of stuff.
John, Jimmy Sexton is obviously a major character in this book, according to what we read in Michael's story about it. He's obviously the famous agent who represents Nick Saban, Lane Kiffin, so many of college football's top coaches. And people hear his name all the time, especially in high-profile coaching searches, that he is this power broker pulling the strings behind the scenes, engineering these mega deals for his clients. How would you describe Jimmy Sexton? Like, what level of power and influence does he actually wield in sports?
You could argue he's the number 1 most powerful person in the sport. Now, I think the top 3 for me, it's probably him, Greg Sankey, and Big Ten Commissioner Tony Petitti. I think those are the 3. Jimmy is so fascinating because, and we write about this in the book, like, I think, at least for me, you have a certain perception of what an agent is, right? And I just always think more of, you know, suave, certain, you know, $3,000 suits, you know, slick back hair, like the Drew Rosenhaus type guys. It's not in Jimmy at all. Maybe the opposite of that. And he is in many ways a ghost. Yeah, I know, not to out Michael here, but Michael and I sometimes will take a photo of Jimmy and send it to people who don't know what he looks like. Like, hey, who do you think this is? Because everybody knows the name, but not a lot of people even know what he looks like. If you Google him, the top photo that comes up is not him, which again, I think speaks to there's a little bit of a Wizard of Oz type thing, but he actually has the power. He likes to kind of pull things behind the scenes. He doesn't like to be interviewed, doesn't really like to talk on the record, likes to just kind of do his own thing and be very private. Somebody who knows him well explained it to me, like, when Jimmy's in a room of power players, he's not going up to anybody. He hangs off to the back and he waits for people to come to him. And that's the amount of power that he has. I've seen it play out in real time. That is a very accurate description of what happens to him. And I think one of the things that's most interesting and multiple people threw this out to me, and I've come to believe it to be in many ways true. You go back 20 or so years ago, Nick Saban first got to LSU, I guess about 25 years ago now, making, I think, $1.2 million in that range. It was a big deal at the time. It got a lot of, criticism. Can't believe a college coach is making $1.2 million. It was a big deal, but, it's still $1.2 million. And I think Jimmy Sexton, more than anyone, has played the biggest role in pushing coaching salaries higher and higher and higher. And I think the unintended consequence of that was that the numbers got so huge, it turned the public tenor around paying players, where it went to be, at one point, it was so taboo. So many people were against it. At a certain point, when you're seeing numerous coaches make more than $10 million a year, and the guys who are generating a lot of that value are making nothing, it became untenable, I think, for a lot of people. So I don't think that Jimmy intended for that to happen, but multiple ADs and other people I talked to put a lot of the blame on him for that. And I do think there's a lot of truth that, he pushed it so high that eventually people said, all right, we got to make changes here. It can't just be these guys getting all of the money, especially with all the TV money that's flown into the sport over the last, 15, 20 years.
Yeah. And before we take a break here, John, your co-author, Armen Keteyian, famously to Alabama fans especially, hosted a 60 Minutes feature on Nick Saban in 2013, and he had pretty unique access to Saban in the program. What insights did he share with you about that experience, and how do you think that may have guided his interest in this subject as y'all wrote this book?
Well, I'll tell you, first off, one of my favorite, before I ever met Armen, I loved that 60 Minutes profile. And my favorite part of it, which I think says so much, even though it's such a small little moment, is this at a youth football camp, they're going down the line and some kid shakes Nick Saban's hand and Nick Saban corrects him on how he shakes his hand. He's like, come on, man, shake it right. And the kid kind of looks bewildered afterwards. And it's it's such a hilarious little moment, but it shows even in a youth camp, Nick Saban wants things done the right way. So I think, it was super helpful for me. I think I have a pretty good feel on Nick Saban as well, but for him to have had other experiences with Nick in private settings that, maybe I haven't always experienced, I think was super helpful. He's had a relationship with Nick's wife, Terry Saban, since then, which I think, proved valuable. And he also later did, when he was at The Athletic, he did a 3-part series on Nick Saban again. So he's been around in these settings. And I think some of that color is definitely helpful. And, I think that 60 Minutes profile was helpful for everybody. I mean, I remember at the time, 60 Minutes doesn't typically do a ton of sports profiles. And so it was, I think, a pretty big deal for Nick Saban at the time too. And, obviously, as Michael knows, Nick Saban doesn't do anything he doesn't want to do. And if there's not a value to him, he's probably not going to do it. And I think he realized there was a lot of value for him and his program to be featured in that way on 60 Minutes.
And he's old school. 60 Minutes, definitely means something more to his generation than it does generations down the road. It's the biggest news magazine show out there. So
it means a lot to me. I want to be clear here. And also as a proud CBS and Paramount employee, everyone should be watching 60 Minutes. They do a great job. I want to be clear there. No, I mean, I'm still of that generation where I would look, maybe this is just a nerdy journalism thing, but I used to look forward to Andy Rooney's pieces at the end of 60 Minutes every week. That was the classic, NFL is over, 60 Minutes is coming up. Let's see what Andy Rooney and his massive eyebrows are going to say now. That was just, I always look forward to that. So maybe Nick Saban was a big Andy Rooney fan too.
Yeah, they're Star Wars nerds. They're journalism nerds. You might be both. I'm a journalism nerd. So
can't believe you like those Andy Rooney segments, Michael. We're with John Talty with 24/7 Sports. The book is The Price: What It Takes to Win in College Football's Era of Chaos. We're going to take a quick break.
We're back on Beat Everyone with John Talty of 24/7 Sports, the co-author with Armen Keteyian of The Price, What It Takes to Win in College Football's Era of Chaos, which is now available. And also Michael Casagrande of AL.com. A major character in this book is Lane Kiffin, former Alabama offensive coordinator, current Ole Miss head coach, college football iconoclast, of course. We're going to have a little fun now and have a Kiffin-themed draft. And we're going to have 3 rounds, and we're going to pick Kiffin's best off-the-field moments at Alabama, his best game he called as Alabama OC, and the best offensive player of the Kiffin era. And so our producers have determined the order here. We're going to go in a snake draft format. First pick is going to go to Michael. I'm going to go second, and our guest, John, is third. I don't know how that happened, but Michael, you get the first pick here. I'm sorry. Yeah, I blame the producers. But Michael, you got first pick here, so let's hear it.
Best Lane Kiffin moment has to be the famous ass chewing on the sideline against the Western Kentucky Hilltoppers, Conference USA juggernaut that is set to come to Bryant-Denny Stadium this Saturday for a huge game, nationally televised, under the lights. But the last time they were in Bryant-Denny Stadium, they had just scored a touchdown, Western Kentucky Hilltoppers, on the mighty Crimson Tide, and they cut over to the sideline, and Nick Saban is chewing out Lane Kiffin, which he would later call an ass chewing, against the Western Kentucky Hilltoppers.
It's a great pick. One thing I loved about the ass chewing moment was down the road when during the 2017 season, we saw Brian Daboll, who was the OC, took Lane Kiffin's place down the road, and he got similar treatment. He got an ass chewing on the sideline, and Kiffin couldn't help himself, and he tweeted about it. And he tweeted, "Those are called ass chewing, son. You were to sit there and say, 'Yes, sir, you're right,'" which I'm sure Daboll loved. So it's a great pick, the ass chewing. I'm second here, and I'm going to go away from this category, and I'm going to go game. And I'm going to pick USC 2016, the season opener.
Next pick.
Not sorry, but that's my pick. Alabama didn't even know who their starting quarterback was that night. Blake Barnett was named the starter, but Cooper Bateman, he was in the mix, and so is true freshman Jalen Hurts, who obviously won the job that night. But USC famously had this ridiculous entrance where they're crawling out of the entrance. They're super pumped to play and possibly even intimidate, maybe even upset Alabama. And Alabama just whips their ass 52-6 when they had no offensive identity. I mean, Jalen Hurts fumbled away the first snap of his career, but he goes on to throw 2 touchdown passes. He runs for 2 more. And Alabama, when they're not even close to their final form yet, haven't even named their starting quarterback. With Lane Kiffin as OC, they still managed to put up 52 points and just end any progress USC had made to come back as a college football power before they even started.
So this would have been my 1-1 pick. This is what I had identified as the top property. So if I can riff off this for a second, because it's like the one thing I actually had prepared, and now I'm going to have to scramble. But the reason why I love that game, for a couple other reasons that you mentioned. One, there's this great anecdote. It was in an ESPN story, I think last year or a couple years ago, about Lane Kiffin, about how they were up big. Lane Kiffin called a play call, a sluggo call that led to a Garrett Dieter touchdown. And allegedly, according to Mike Loxley in this ESPN story, Saban starts yelling at Lane over the headsets and says, like, "Does that make you feel good?" It's like, "Is that going to get you your job back?" And Lane said, "No, it doesn't, but it does feel good." And apparently Saban just started immediately yelling at him. And within that one play call that led to them going up big, Dieter immediately starts celebrating with the fans instead of his teammates. And in their Monday film review the next time, Saban just starts screaming at him about, "You celebrate with your teammates, not the fans." He said, "You didn't even have fans at your last school," which was, I think, Bowling Green. So little ricochet shot for there. So that's me vamping as I try to come up with some ideas. I guess I'll go, because we haven't done it yet, I'll go best player. I think it has to be Derrick Henry, the only Heisman winner. There's other ones you can say he might have unlocked more, but 2015 team is always going to be my personal favorite team. The hurdles that they had early on in the season, kind of an underdog team. I think you could still argue maybe the least talented title team of Saban's career. And it took a little bit of time, but Kiffin was able to unlock something in Derrick Henry, especially in the second half of that season, where he just turned into an absolute monster and the most dominant SEC running back I have seen since I've been covering the SEC. And again, winning a Heisman Trophy is huge, and winning a national championship with some of the surrounding pieces they had, it doesn't happen without Derrick Henry. So that's going to be my pick there. And then I'll go best moment. I think it's kind of a combo too. It's them winning the national championship. It's kind of Lane Kiffin's crowning moment of he's been rehabilitated. All these, all the journey to get here, he finally wins, but then he gets left at the stadium because the bus left without him. Like that to me is just like the perfect Lane Kiffin moment of like, he finally gets back to the mountaintop, and yet there's still some little indignity that knocks him down a slight peg. So that to me, again, I had the two picks you guys had at the top of my list. I got to go down my list a little bit, but those are the two that I'm going with here.
Amazing picks. I love that, like, unlocking Derrick Henry is just giving him the ball 46 times in the Iron Bowl, right? Just give the guy the ball and let him run. What I loved about Lane Kiffin is he knew who the playmakers were, and he knew how to put the ball in their hands, even if it meant just handing it to them and letting them make a play. And we'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute, hopefully, if I'm able to make my pick. For my next pick, I'm going to go with moment 2. And now this is technically an on-the-field moment, but Kiffin himself is not on the field. He's standing on the sideline, but nobody believed in Kiffin's game plan more than Kiffin himself. And a couple of the greatest moments in his time at Alabama are when his quarterback throws a deep pass and Kiffin's arms go up in the air because he knows it's a touchdown many seconds before anybody even catches the ball. The play is drawn up perfectly. It appears to be executed perfectly. He's got the defense that he wants, and the ball is in the air, and Kiffin knows it's a touchdown if they come down with this ball. And it's just, sparked memes, Twitter moments, just hilarious results as a result of Lane Kiffin's personality. I mean, raising his arms to signal a touchdown before the ball even leaves the hands of the quarterback in some cases. But it happened a few times during the 2014 season when Blake Sims threw deep balls to Amari Cooper and DeAndre White against Florida, Auburn, Missouri games. Like Kiffin, he's done the same, at Florida Atlantic and Ole Miss, but obviously he did it several times at Alabama, sometimes even throwing his play sheet in the process. And I guess, look, sometimes you just know you're good.
Yeah, well, we got another Talty situation where that was going to be my pick for game was going to be a split pick between 2014 and 2016, both trips to Knoxville when he was Alabama's OC. The 14 game, it was maybe the first of many touchdowns. The hands up Amari Cooper touchdown. It was one of the first times I really remember at least ESPN capturing that moment. That was a nasty beatdown that night in Knoxville. I can't remember the final, but you could feel sort of there was some feeling behind that with maybe the way the way fans reacted to his departure in 2009, after 2009. But then 2016, I believe a similar type blowout where he flipped his visor to a Tennessee fan on the way off the field. I feel like that might have been the ultimate Lane Kiffin moment of just irreverence, mischievousness, there were all Alabama fans around that tunnel, and he found the Tennessee fan who was standing there in disgust, and that was where the visor went. So I thought, if there anything describes Lane Kiffin in that moment, I guess it snakes back around to me, so I get to make my final pick. For player, I'm going to pick Blake Sims, his quarterback in 2014. Just a guy who probably wasn't the best. It wasn't the best quarterback he had in his time there. Was able to do a lot with him. They got all the way to the number 1 seed in the first playoff. His ability to dial in the deep ball, the Blake Sims to Amari Cooper was the biggest part of that season. To take a team that everyone thought Jay Coker was going to be the starting quarterback from the time he transferred from Florida State. That was all that offseason was. We were looking at Zapruder films of him throwing passes a million miles. But Blake Sims was the guy who became the first starting quarterback really under Kiffin at Alabama and took a player who wouldn't make the Mount Rushmore of Nick Saban era quarterbacks, and had him as a number one player, had the number one team in the country going into the playoffs. So Blake Sims is my pick.
It's a great pick. I mean, I was tempted to take him. I would have taken him. I feel like there were no expectations for Blake Sims. Like nobody had any idea what he would do in the position. I think a lot of people thought that the quarterback room was depleted after A.J. McCarron left. And, most people assumed that Jake Coker was just going to come in from Florida State and win the job automatically. And Blake Sims obviously outworked him. It was fifth-year senior, I believe, and he won the job and he set records at the position. Obviously, thanks in part to Lane Kiffin, but Sims was just a gamer. Like I honestly wish that we could have seen him for more than just one season as the starting quarterback. And it's wild given the type of runner that he was, that he did most of it with his arm. I mean, he was so shifty and could have done more with his legs, but he gave Alabama amazing opportunities to extend drives by escaping the pocket, scrambling for first down runs. So I love Blake Sims. He was incredibly entertaining, fun player to watch. My pick, this is my last pick, and I got to pick a player now. You referenced him. It's Amari Cooper. And Amari Cooper, I mean, look, if somebody said this is the greatest player in the history of Alabama, I wouldn't necessarily argue against whoever said that. I mean, Amari Cooper, just top to bottom, one of the best players I've ever seen in my life. I mean, he signaled a bit of a sea change for Alabama, partially, because it marked Lane Kiffin's first season with the program. And you had, a first-year starter at quarterback with Blake Sims, who turned out to be an excellent downfield passer to find a guy like Amari Cooper. But Kiffin built the entire offense around Cooper. This guy just burst out of the gate his freshman year with 1,000 yards receiving, 11 touchdowns, and he had a pretty good sophomore campaign. But when his junior year was just unbelievable. He was a Heisman finalist, Biletnikoff winner. Nobody could stop him. I mean, one-on-one, forget about it. He had 1,700 yards, 14 touchdowns, had one of the greatest individual performances I've ever seen in the 2014 Iron Bowl, which was a shootout and one of the greatest games of the Kiffin era too. So Amari Cooper, he's had a great. Fired. Say again?
He got Auburn's DC fired because they wouldn't bump him off the line. He had free release on every one of those plays, and I can't remember which one it was, but got him fired for that.
There was nothing you could do. Like literally, there was nothing you could do. I think I heard an old assistant coach say fairly recently that he wasn't the most talented wide receiver that Alabama ever recruited, but he was the best wide receiver that Alabama ever had in its history, or at least while he was there. So Amari Cooper, my number one Lane Kiffin era player. So it goes back to you, John.
Well, I'll note that the three guys I had written down were Henry, Blake Sims, and Amari. So I'm glad that we got all those guys, and was tempted to pick both of them. Again, I'm going to go back to 2015. This was tough. Again, I only wrote one game down, which was the game that you got, Ben. So didn't do my homework quite there. I really thought I was getting that one. I'm going to go with, I think, a game that had major impact, both short-term and long-term. And that's them beating Georgia in 2015. Here's why I'm picking it. One, they'd already lost to Ole Miss. At that point, any loss, the season's over, right? And I think we look at Lane Kiffin so much differently if he doesn't win a national championship there. And I think that was crucial for getting them back on track. Georgia was a top 10 team. Michael, I remember you were there. I mean, it was a rainy, gross game. There was a lot of hype about Georgia, and Bama just shut them down. Here's the second part of it. You can definitely argue that game got Mark Richt fired, which leads to Kirby Smart building the Death Star. There's a Star Wars reference for you, Michael. The Death Star that they currently have in Athens. So I think it's kind of a butterfly type effect where it was huge for Lane Kiffin's career, but you can argue it kind of the long-term consequence is it leads to Kirby Smart, who at the time was in Alabama, switching sides, going to Georgia, and building the monster that he's got in Athens. So that's going to be not a game that people probably thought about a lot, but I think that's the one that I like the most in terms of rounding out my team here.
That was good. Can I throw in one more, a 1B for player if I had to pick? I think for as good as Lane Kiffin's offenses were, they were very good when he was there. I think when they would fail, when they would stumble, you always need a good punter. And J.K. Scott was a legend of his time, and I think spent his entire time at Alabama. So whenever Lane Kiffin screwed something up, J.K. Scott was there to clean things up.
I fully agreed, and Lane Kiffin deserves most of the credit there, I think, for J.K.'s career. And what I will say about Lane Kiffin, though, especially as a quarterback coach, I thought that what he did at Alabama was pretty remarkable in that
he had 3 projects all 3 years he was the OC. All 3 of those years, they were first-time starting quarterbacks at the best program, arguably, in the nation under the strict, obviously, style of Nick Saban. And he won 3 straight SEC championships, went to the playoff all 3 years, went to the national championship 2 of those years. Just pretty remarkable. I mean, he turned Blake Sims and Jay Coker and obviously a true freshman into elite players at the highest level. So he's a good coach. I don't think anybody questions that about Lane Kiffin. So let's quickly
put one more statue out there on the Walk of Champions right next to Saban.
I don't think anybody would. But when Saban retired, they put Little Debbie's and Coke cans and other things like that at the foot of. I don't know what they would put at the foot of a Lane Kiffin statue, and I wouldn't like to guess either.
Can I give you something to bring this full circle?
Sure.
Little tidbit from the book. Lane Kiffin wanted the Alabama job when Nick Saban retired, and he tried to get into the mix and could not get into the mix. And I think that's just a really interesting, kind of wrinkle to all what we're talking about here. And you could argue partly why he couldn't get the job is all the things that we're talking about here today. But I think it's interesting that the who's going to replace Nick Saban conversation has been happening for so long. We always would come up with these lists, and Lane Kiffin was always one that maybe he could be the guy, and he wanted to be the guy. I know that from multiple people, and he just could not get any traction in that coaching search, which of course ultimately ended up being Kalen DeBoer. And I think we're all excited to see with college football kicking off this week, how that turns out.
100%. Well, let's go through real quick what each guy's pick was. Michael, first overall pick, ass chewing. Was your moment
against Western
Blake
Kentucky.
Sims was your player. And remind me, what was your game?
I split up between the 2014 and 2016 Tennessee games.
Right. Got it. Tennessee. And then I had hands up for the touchdowns as my moment. I had Amari Cooper as my player. I had USC 2016 as my game. And then, John, you had the bus leaves Kiffin as your moment. Derrick Henry as your player. Georgia 2015 as your game. I think that's some pretty awesome representation of what all Lane Kiffin contributed. I think I won the draft, frankly. I'll make the case for myself, but I think y'all did a good job. So hats off to you.
That this is put up to like a poll or something like that,
right?
That the voters penalize Michael for trying to get 2 picks in one. That needs to be, that's like a DQ.
Well, they're going to penalize me for talking about the Western Kentucky Hilltoppers, home of the greatest journalism school in all of the land.
Oh my gosh.
Well, the book
we
by
were
John
having such a good moment here, and then you got to ruin it.
Thank you, Michael. The book by John Talty, co-written by Armen Keteyian, is called The Price: What It Takes to Win in College Football's Era of Chaos. It's out now. Go get it. John, best of luck with the book, and thank you so much for doing this.
Appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
Awesome. And Michael Casagrande of AL.com, thank you too. You can find Beat Everyone on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in Thursday for more amazing stories with Eli Gold. And for Michael Casagrande, I'm Ben Flanagan. We'll see you next time. This episode of Beat Everyone is brought to you by Broadway Joe's Fantasy Sports. Inspired by football legend Joe Namath, embrace the thrill of daily fantasy sports like never before in an app coming this fall.